Hello, it's nice to be able to talk to you, though I'm very sorry not to be with you today in Seoul. But of course, the advantages in being able to use the internet like this and to record lectures, it means it reduces carbon emissions compared to if I flew. And of course, things like that are increasingly important. So I think actually we should be doing more of this sort of communication. But anyway, this is an important conference. I'm very glad to be able to contribute to it. I'm going to talk about the research we've done on inequality over many years. I started off looking at the effects of income inequality between rich and poor on things like health, on death rates, life expectancy, but from there went on to look at a number of other things. So I'm going to tell you about research we've done using the scale of income differences between rich and poor in different countries and seeing how it relates to a number of different outcomes. I'm going to take you through the data, scattergrams of different countries, but we also did this work, we repeated it all on the 50 American states, looking to see whether the same picture emerged if you compared more and less equal states as we saw comparing more and less equal countries. And the picture is almost exactly the same. So I'm going to start with this slide, my second slide, and there you'll see an index of health and social problems. Contains all those outcomes that you see listed on the left, downloaded from international agencies like WHO and OECD and so on. We've made an index of those outcomes. They're all weighted equally. And what you're seeing there, we've got income inequality along the bottom, and so the most unequal societies on the right, the most equal ones on the left. And you see the USA, with the most unequal incomes, is doing worst on all those kinds of outcomes. So as you all know, it has very high homicide rates, has low life expectancy compared to other rich countries. It has high obesity rates. It has more people in prison. So in all sorts of ways, it does badly. But the more equal countries on the left doing much better. But it's not only that index. You see just the same thing if you look in my next slide, number 3, at measures of child well-being from from UNICEF. It contains lots of different measures of child well-being. So how kids do at school in these maths and literacy scores, whether they feel they can talk to their parents, what immunization rates are like, whether they have books at home, all that goes into this measure of child well-being. And here you see lower scores on the right amongst the more unequal countries. On this graph, unlike the previous one, low scores are bad outcomes. The previous one, high scores were bad outcomes. On the next slide, number 4, you can see imprisonment rates. The proportion of the population locked up in each country in relation to that same measure of inequality. And you see, again, the more unequal countries have much higher prison populations. It's a log scale on the vertical axis, but there are about 10-fold differences in the proportion of the population locked up. That's not simply more crime, it's mainly more punitive sentencing. You get sent to prison more easily and for longer in more unequal countries. I may say that's a very expensive system to run, if you like, and we found some American states spend more on imprisonment than on higher education. In slide number 5, you can see bullying in schools. So this is the proportion of 11-year-olds who bullied others more than twice in the previous month. You can see, again, huge differences in the rates of bullying in more and less unequal countries. On the next slide, it's a particularly important relationship. It's social mobility. Many people, I think, believe that inequality is quite fair if everyone can find their right level in society. But what this is showing is there is less social mobility in more unequal societies. In a way, I suppose what it's showing is that parents pass on their advantages and disadvantages to their children, and the bigger the income differences are in the society, the less movement there is up and down the social hierarchy. In a sense, I think what happens is class and status become more important in those societies, but it also means that in those more unequal societies, we are further away from equal opportunities for children. If you really want to gain equal opportunities for children, what you should do is reduce the inequalities amongst their parents. It's an obvious point, but it's very rarely made. The next slide is also, I think, a particularly important slide. I first saw this when I met Kanku Lee at the Asia Forum in Seoul a couple of years ago. It's important because many people think that inequality spurs initiative, creativity, drive, and so on, and think that our innovation would just stop if we didn't have inequality to spur people into action. But what this shows actually is the opposite of that, that in more unequal societies, there are, at least as measured by patents per head of population, there's less inventiveness in more unequal societies. Patents are the legal protection you may take out if you invent something important. So fewer of those per head of population in more unequal countries. My next slide, number 8, it's the first of a short series of slides I want to show you to give you an idea of what I think is the fundamental damage that inequality does to society. It really shows what it does to the quality of social relations between us. In a sense, I think it's important to see inequality as increasing class differences, making status differences more important. But with that, it reduces social cohesion. People have less to do with each other in society. So this is a measure of civic participation, how much people take part in local groups and voluntary organizations. And you see the societies on the right with bigger income differences, much lower levels of participation in local groups. The next slide is a measure of whether people feel they can trust others. And you see in more unequal societies, a much smaller proportion of the population agree that most people can be trusted. I may say we did all this work twice. All these outcomes I've been showing you, we looked at them not only in the rich developed countries, but also amongst the 50 American states, looking to see again whether the more unequal American states did badly and the more equal ones did well. The picture is almost exactly the same. Inequality had the same effects in both settings. And indeed, there are now hundreds of papers looking at these issues and controlling for all sorts of other things, not only poverty and so on, but incomes right across the scale for education and all sorts of possible confounders. So we're very sure that these are causal relationships, and indeed we did a paper looking at causality. But anyway, so in more unequal societies, people not only have less to do with each other locally, but they trust each other less. Another bit of research, I think, that is and it's a new piece of research. It shows the likelihood from measured in psychological experiments of getting your wallet back. If you lose your wallet, how often will it be returned to you? And again, you see very big effects of income differences. So if you're in one of the more equal countries, you've got an 80% chance of getting your wallet back if you lose it. In a more unequal countries, perhaps only 20% chance of getting it back. So there are differences in honesty between more and less equal countries. On the next slide, number 11, you can see a relationship with homicide rates. The red dots are American states, the blue triangles are Canadian provinces. This is a very well-researched relationship. People have looked at it in dozens of papers all around the world, and there is a pretty reliable relationship between more inequality and higher homicide rates, basically because homicide is triggered by people feeling looked down on and disrespected, and you can imagine how inequality makes those problems worse. So what you're seeing with growing inequality is that you lose the reciprocity, you lose the community life, you lose the trust, you get more violence. There are also papers that show that people are less willing to help each other, to help the aged or people with disabilities. But as the next slide, number 12, shows, you also get an increase in the proportion of the population employed in what's been called guard labor. So people in occupations like security staff, police, prison officers, occupations like that are really the occupations we use to protect ourselves from each other. So with more dishonesty, more violence, less social cohesion, we need more people to protect us from each other. And that, again, that relationship has been shown not only amongst the rich developed countries, but also amongst the 50 American states. I want now to turn to what's been happening to income distribution and maybe how we can reverse the trends. I mean, it really is an appalling cost of inequality. And basically, it's because of the psychosocial effects of inequality. It's not simply that inequality may create poverty. It's that it increases those feelings of superiority and inferiority, whether you feel looked up to and admired or looked down on and disrespected. And that's really so important. And we have an inherited sensitivity to issues to do with social status, and they matter much more in more unequal societies. But in the next slide, number 13, you can see a pattern of changing inequality that is really common to a great many countries. You see from this is measures of inequality in different countries from 1930 to 2015. And you see that nearly always income differences start to narrow sometime in the 1930s. They go on narrowing till the late 1970s, and then there's the modern rise in inequality. And that happens in many more countries than shown there. It really is an international trend. One of the contributors to it, shown in slide 14, is the widening income differences within big corporations. So this is the biggest 350 American corporations, and it shows the scale of income differences within those companies. And you see in the 1970s and early 80s, the CEOs were getting 30 or 40 times as much as the average production worker in those companies. But by the first decade of this century, they were getting, the differential had increased tenfold. They were getting 300 or 400 times as much as the average production worker. So partly what we're seeing is the effect of the runaway incomes at the top. I think that pattern of declining inequalities from the 30s and then rising inequality from the 1980s is really a reflection of first the rise and then the fall of labor movements in different countries, social democratic movements, probably also the fear of communism, which led to change in policies. For instance, Roosevelt's New Deal from around the 1930s, which redistribute income, but then a complete change in policy and ideology from 1980 onwards, where you get free market fundamentalism, neoconservatism, whatever you like to call it, which became really an international ideology, led to lower top tax rates, led to these runaway top incomes. Interestingly, I think that is shown very clearly in this graph on slide 15. That top red line shows the decline of income differences, that same U-shaped pattern as I showed you earlier, in the 1930s, and then the rise of inequality from sometime in the 1980s. The bottom line in blue is the proportion of the population in trade unions. I don't think trade union membership in itself makes such an enormous difference. I think it's important to people's well-being and wages and so on, but I think it's also here acting as an indicator of the strength of the labor movement, the importance of social democratic parties, the idea that there's a different way of running a society, which may produce a better quality of life for all of us. And as that dies away, income inequality rises again. So I think we've got to somehow recapture that control, that idea that there is a better way of running society, a more democratic way, less individualistic. And on my slide 16, you can see some of the things that we think make a difference. So basically, you can reduce income differences either by reducing income differences before tax, the differences in original income, or through redistributing through taxes and benefits. We think it's important to have stronger trade unions, but I think in modern societies it'll be very difficult to regain the former strength of trade unions. But I do think that what we can do is democratize our companies, employee representation of different sorts. Nearly half the member countries of the European Union have some legislation for employee representation on company boards. It's usually pretty weak, but in some countries like Germany, it's quite strong. And I do think it helps constrain income differences. I think also that, for instance, in Japan, one of the things that used to constrain income differences, there's more of the members of the board of directors were promoted from within the company. So they had loyalty to other employees instead of being a sort of financial elite parachuted into the company. I think that makes a difference too. And those are all ways, I think, that we can get greater equality of income more deeply embedded into our societies. Taxes and benefits are important, but their weakness is they can be undone very easily. But I think we must stop tax avoidance. So many of the super rich hide their money away in tax havens. We must make sure those tax havens are closed. And in most countries, I think income tax is no longer nearly as progressive as it used to be. And in Britain and America, in the 1960s and 70s, top tax rates were 80 or 90%, the marginal rate of tax at the top for top incomes. And now they're back to, 40% or something, very low. So those are the sort of strategies I think are the first to explore for reducing income inequalities. I may say if we don't do that, we're seeing the political ramifications of very high income differences. It's the more unequal countries who've elected the worst leaders. What are they called? the far right countries, which have already shown how bad they are dealing with COVID-19, much higher rates in those countries like the United States, Brazil. Britain's record is poor. Korea has done fairly well. So that's all very, very brief. And on 17, my last slide, you can see, if you want to read more about this, we go into this evidence in much more detail in that book, which I think is available now in Korean as well. We have produced a later book on the psychological effects of inequality. And I think that too is available in Korean, but what I've been talking about now is in this book, The Spirit Level. So thank you very much. I'm glad to be able to contribute.